everybody. My name is Susan Philpott, and I am a park ranger at the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument. And I'm so happy to be with you today to share some stories in suffrage and the ongoing struggle for equality. Just want to make sure, let me know if you can't see my screen. I will assume everybody can now see my screen with my name and the National Park Service logo there. So happy to be coming to you today, which is the day after our birthday. Belmont-Paul became a part of the National Park Service 7 years ago yesterday on April 12th, 2016, by presidential proclamation. That's the reason we are a national monument and not National Historical Site like if any of you attended last week, some of my colleagues from Women's Rights National Historical Park. A national monument becomes a monument by presidential proclamation rather than by congressional legislation. For a long time, people fought to have this become part of the National Park Service, and I've been very fortunate to be a part of this interpretive staff there since the site became a National Park Service site. This is my park, and this is a picture I took in February. You'll notice the scaffolding there. The site is not open to visitors right now. It is a 200-year-old house, and when the National Park Service, when it became a National Park Service site, a big part of the mission was to do a lot of repairs and renovations to the house so that it can continue to tell these stories for many generations to come. This was the headquarters of the National Woman's Party, founded by Alice Paul. It's right in downtown, right on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., on the corner of Constitution Avenue and Maryland Avenue and 2nd Street Northeast. That white building you see in the background there, that is the Hart Senate office building. So a bunch of senators have their offices looking down over our site, and right across the street is the Supreme Court building. We can see the Capitol Dome nearby. And so this is the inside of the building, or at least what it looked like before. Right now, everything that you see in this picture, most of it has been removed for the renovation work, and we are looking forward to being able to bring that back. It's gotten some updates and a new coat of paint. This is a place you can get a sense from looking at this site that this is a place where we tell the stories about women and the accomplishments of women. And so we're going to be talking today about kind of the soul of American women, equality in the 20th century. If you have been reading along with the book, The Soul of America by John Meacham, you might be familiar with some of these stories, or if you've watch the documentary, but you don't have to have done either of them to appreciate these stories. This is in that same hallway looking the opposite way. So that beautiful stained glass window is behind you, and you can see some more of those paintings of people, and also the busts. For those who attended last week, you might recognize the bust in the back. Here is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the founding mothers of the women's rights movement, organizing the Seneca Falls Convention in July 1848, the first time in American history that people were coming together, particularly for the purpose of talking about the issue of women's rights and women's equality. Those people that we think of as being connected to that fight, if you know a little bit about the story, you might know Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You probably have heard of Susan B. Anthony, who spent her entire life fighting for the cause of women's rights, and particularly women's right to vote. They worked their whole lives for that and never got to see it. They had to pass it on to the next generation and generations beyond to take up the fight. And so we tell, at our site, we tell the story of kind of those next generations, those who came along after in the early 20th century, including one of the women who give her name to this house, Alice Paul, who you can see in the bust right here. Alice Paul was known for having a really keen political mind, for knowing how to keep people talking about issues and keep the issue of women's right to vote, or suffrage is another word for it, in the news, to keep people talking about it. You probably notice also from this picture, this great big mirror in the middle of the hallway. There are several mirrors throughout the museum. You'll see some of those pictures as we go through. And when the National Women's Party created these exhibits, so the Park Service came into a site that was already a women's equality museum, and we've been telling the stories from these exhibits that the National Women's Party created. They use these mirrors as interactive spaces. So if you were standing in this hallway with me and looking at yourself in the mirror, you might notice that there's a frame around, kind of a sticker on the mirror. So if you were looking at yourself in the mirror, it would look like you were in the frame, like you were one of these people that were on the walls. And that's part of that idea that, you know, we might know a few big names like Alice Paul, Susan B. Anthony, but this work was thousands and thousands of women and men making contributions, doing different things, pushing the work forward. Alice Paul later said that she saw the movement as like a mosaic. Everybody put in their own stone. And so everybody had something different they could do. Alice Paul was particularly good at finding something that you could do and encouraging you that you can do it and you should do it. In fact, I've heard some stories about people who came into this space later on when Alice Paul was elderly. And it looked very similar to this at that time, that there were busts and images and paintings, and she would point at those pictures and say to new young women coming in, do you know who these women are? You should know about these stories. But also she would say, do you know who your member of Congress is and who your senators are? Let me find them for you, and you can give them a call and tell them while we're here, tell them about what you support for women's equality. So she didn't want to tell too many stories of the past. She wanted to say, what are you doing now for the cause of equality? John Meacham's book is written at a time where you can tell he's kind of in despair a bit as he's writing this book, with the state of the country and the state of politics. And what he's doing is telling different stories as a way to say, you know, things seem really bad and divisive and awful now. The country has been through awful things like this before. And one of the quotes he says in his introduction is, to know what has come before is to be armed against despair. So if we learn these stories about times when things were bad and how we wrestled with, as quoting Lincoln, he says, you know, that we came to grips with our better angels and things got better, that we could find hope in that. And one of the stories he tells, although honestly in the book, not very much, although there's more in the documentary, but is this story that we're going to talk about today, the story of the fight of women fighting for the vote. So getting in touch with the past, with history, as a way to deal with and figure out what to do here in the present. And the people whose stories I tell certainly did that. In fact, these are two of the prized items from the National Women's Party collection. On the right there, you see Elizabeth Cady Stanton's chair. It was given to the National Women's Party by her daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was part of that next generation, continuing the fight. And one of the things I love when looking at this chair is you probably notice, I don't know if you can tell from this picture, but the seat part of the chair is really long. And that was because in the 19th century, women had to wear big bustles and skirts and things. So they needed chairs with long seats to be able to sit down. It must not have been very comfortable. And I look at that chair and I think about Elizabeth Cady Stanton at a time when even the furniture was gendered, that she somehow had the audacity to say that women should be treated equally and to come up with a whole list called the Declaration of Sentiments of all the ways that women were treated unequally and what needed to change. And even at that Women's Rights Convention, the idea that women should have the right to vote, as she put it, that it is the sacred duty of women to it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. Oh, I didn't mean to go ahead there yet, because I also wanted to talk about on the left there, that is Susan B. Anthony's desk. So Susan B. Anthony had a lot of offices. She traveled all around the country, and one of the places she travels was here to Washington, D.C. And that desk was in her office. And after she died in 1906, her longtime DC secretary had it. And then she gave it to Alice Paul as a way to say, you are taking up Susan's work. And so these are items that the women of the generation that we're going to talk about really sort of used as touchstones to remind them of the people who had come before, the women who had started this work that they were continuing. And you can get a sense of how they treasured particularly that desk. This is the members of the National Women's Party all posing around the desk, which they have taken outside, I guess, to get a better picture. This is Alice Paul standing next to the desk, and then sitting down in front of it is the Belmont of Belmont-Paul. That's Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. She was a very wealthy, gilded-aged widow who had a fortune several times over and used her money in the fight for equality for the labor movement and then eventually for women's suffrage. And she found a kindred spirit in Alice Paul because Alva was a little concerned that the suffrage leaders who had taken up the work from Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were a little too concerned with being respectable and gracious, that, you know, women could win the vote by proving themselves to be upstanding moral citizens. Alva didn't think things were going to change that way. She found a kindred spirit in Alice Paul, too, who was willing to stir things up a little bit and cause some trouble. So Alva became the primary benefactor of all of the work of that Alice Paul was doing. So I'm not going to have, I don't think, any other pictures of Alva, but know that everything that's happening, it's Alva's money that's often making it happen, because it doesn't just take courage and creativity, it takes cash too. Now, interestingly, Alice Paul did not get involved in the fight for women's right to vote because of Susan B. Anthony or others of that generation. She got involved as a suffragist by first being a suffragette. That was the term for the women fighting for the right to vote in Britain. Alice Paul was attending graduate school at the London School of Economics, and she heard a very rousing, passionate speech by Christabel Pankhurst, daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, and was really moved by how she heard Christabel talking, what she was talking about, but also the way she responded to the catcalls and abuse of the men in the crowd around her, and she got fired up. Now, the suffragettes, like I said, could give rousing speeches just like Susan B. Anthony could, just like other suffragists could, but they also did things like scheduling big demonstrations that would shut down everything in London. They'd show up where politicians were speaking and heckle them and interrupt them. They'd break into places where women weren't allowed, and cause all kinds of trouble. Their slogan was deeds, not words. And some of those deeds included things like throwing rocks and breaking windows. Even later on in the movement, they started setting things on fire. That was after Alice left. But for all of these things, you can imagine the women got arrested. They went to jail. That picture on the right is Emmeline Pankhurst getting arrested. Alice Paul joined in with these demonstrations, and she got arrested, and she went to jail along with the British suffragettes. And along with them, she went on hunger strikes. That was a way to symbolize your protest by putting their very bodies on the line. Basically, you think you can shut us up by locking us away? How will it look for you if we die on your watch? And so the British officials' response to the hunger strikes was force feeding, which was just a brutal process. And Alice Paul endured forced feeding in jails in the United Kingdom. And she's getting the attention of the American press, who are wondering, who is this crazy American girl who's out there doing these things? So when Alice Paul returned to the United States in 1910, she was kind of a celebrity. There were reporters waiting for her on the dock in Philadelphia to interview her. Miss Paul, are you going to join the American women's suffrage movement? They wanted to do. No. And her response was, I didn't know there was an American women's suffrage movement, which must have been very upsetting to all of the American women suffragists, some of the leaders of whom you see over here on the right. Looks like they're at the White House, actually. Especially in the middle here, we've got Anna Howard Shaw, who was the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NAWSA, we call it NASA for short. And standing next to her is Carrie Chapman Catt, who would end up being a hugely important figure in the women's suffrage movement in the 20th century. Also Alice Paul's nemesis, and in a certain extent. Now, Alice Paul, when she got back first, she had to finish her PhD. And at the same time, the NASA is continuing with their campaigns and their affiliate offices all around the country, working to win women the vote state by state. That's really, the Constitution says states determine who can vote. And so they were trying to change state constitutions to remove the word male for eligible voters, trying to get women the vote one state at a time. And they'd had some success, particularly in the West. The first states where women could vote were Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, and Colorado. And then in the early 1910s, some more states are joining, California and Washington and Oregon. So there's some progress there. But Alice Paul is kind of impatient with that. She sees places where women win the vote and then lose it. She sees places where they can vote in maybe for school board or maybe for local elections, but not in national elections. And she feels like this is just going on too long. And this is not going to work, this incremental progress. It's going to take forever. She wants to see some of that energy she saw in Britain here in the United States. Now, she doesn't start breaking windows. But what she does decide is we need a big spectacle event that's going to get everybody's attention. So she decides to organize a woman's suffrage procession down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. on March 3rd, 1913, which is the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration, taking over the inaugural route. This is a picture of the exhibit panel in the museum about that big suffrage procession. And she gathers women from all around the country to come here to Washington, D.C., to represent their states, to represent their colleges and universities or their professions. There were floats, there were bands. Men marched too. Men who supported women's right to vote were often called suffragettes. The procession begins with this woman you see in the upper left-hand corner, Inez Milholland. She was very accomplished as a lawyer. She was a dynamic public speaker, but people really knew her because she was very pretty. She was known as the most beautiful suffragist. So Alice Paul kind of uses that and gets Inez Milholland on a white horse, all in white, the new woman of the 20th century. This is not your grandmother's suffrage movement. She's making the argument. This is what a feminist looks like. And by the way, that crown that Inez is wearing with the Star of Hope on top, that would eventually inspire the design of Wonder Woman's tiara. So Inez, maybe the first Wonder Woman there. And basically, Alice Paul has this idea that she is going to tell the story right in the landscape of the nation's capital, right along the inaugural route of all the accomplishments of women and why women need to be enfranchised, they need to have the right to vote, and why they're going to lodge their protest that they have been left out of this whole political process right there in Washington, D.C. So the next day, that new president is going to be walking in their footsteps. Now, Alice Paul is an upper middle class Quaker woman, white Quaker woman from New Jersey. And so she's sort of telling this story from her perspective and people who look like her. Now, she does think that, probably some Black women will march. Maybe there will be some Native American women. They have a float about women from other lands. You can see some other nations represented here. But she's not really including anybody who doesn't look like her in the process planning. And some of the women from Washington, D.C. tell Alice Paul, oh no, Washington, D.C. is a Southern town. You cannot have Black and white women marching together in your procession. The Southern white women won't have it. So Alice Paul kind of tries to maybe keep them from marching, keeping Black women leaders from marching. And then, okay, if that doesn't work, maybe you could just march in the back behind the men. Sometimes if you read histories of this, I don't remember if it mentions this in the documentary, but you'll hear the story that Black women had to march in the back in this procession. And that is actually not true. That's the way Alice Paul remembered it later when she was elderly. And it seems like what she wanted. But the fact is that the Black women refused to be segregated in the back. And we know a few of those stories. We have reporting in the NAACP magazine, The Crisis, by Carrie Clifford, about different delegations that Black women marched in. We know about the brand new sorority at Howard University's Delta Sigma Theta that had just been formed for the purpose of these women being more civically engaged. The first action they take is to march in the suffrage procession with their mentor, Mary Church Terrell, who you see on the right. And Mary Church Terrell told the story that she made sure that the Deltas marched with the other university women by appealing to her friend Inez Milholland, whose father was one of the founders of the NAACP, and who also very much cared about racial justice as well. So if Alice Paul was holding Inez Milholland up as the symbol of the new woman of the 20th century, maybe she'd have paid a little more attention to the values that Inez was representing. Interestingly, Mary Church Terrell was an internationally known suffragist. She'd spoken in several different languages around the world about the cause of women's right to vote. So she had decades in this work before Alice Paul ever came along. And she would continue to participate in in campaigns that Alice Paul organized, even though she regularly sort of felt disrespected. In fact, confiding to Walter Wright, head of the NAACP, that she thought that if Alice Paul could get the vote only for white women, she would. But nevertheless, she continued to work with Alice Paul despite that disrespect that she was receiving. One of my favorite stories, though, is about the Illinois delegation at the procession. This is, you can see some of the women, the Illinois suffragists lining up, getting ready to march in the procession. Somewhere around the time this picture was taken, the woman you see in the middle there, Grace Trout, turned to arguably the most famous member of her delegation, Ida B. Wells Barnett, who, again, internationally known crusader, fighter for justice, and an investigative journalist who's done incredible work in the cause of fighting against racial violence and lynching. Also a suffragist, also has organized a suffrage club in Illinois, in Chicago. So she comes with the Illinois delegation, but then Grace Trout turns to her and says, you know, Mrs. Wells Barnett, we've heard that the organizers of this procession don't want black and white women marching together. So we think you can't march with us. You need to go march in the back. And Ida B. Wells was furious. And she got very upset and even began to cry and said that I was asked to march with Illinois and I'll march here where I belong or not at all. And she stormed off. She didn't leave or go to the back, though. She waited along the procession route so that when the Illinois delegation passed by, she stepped right out and took her rightful place. And this is the only picture we have of that moment. It's a picture from the Chicago Daily Tribune, so a picture of the newspaper, but you can see the very determined look on Ida B. Wells's face as she takes her rightful place there. The two women to her right in that picture, Belle Brooks and Virginia Brooks, and I forgot Belle's last name. They left with her and waited with her along the parade route. Belle Squire, that's her name, and then stepped out with her. So showing the importance of allyship there as well. So the first float in the procession that everybody sees has the mission statement of Alice Paul on it. It says, "We demand an amendment to the United States Constitution enfranchising the women of this country." So Alice Paul is saying, forget that one state at a time, little by little incremental progress. We are determined to change the U.S. Constitution to ensure the vote for every woman across the country. And perhaps the most provocative word in that banner is the word demand. You know, respectable, gracious women are not supposed to be demanding things. Maybe asking, maybe petitioning, but demanding. Alice Paul is trying to get people's attention and get them riled up, and it works. The picture on the right you see of the actual float, the one on the left is a replica banner in our museum, but on the right you see a picture of the actual float on Pennsylvania Avenue, and you can see it is swarmed with people. There are about 250,000 people come out to see this procession, and they don't stay on the sidewalks. And the police don't do anything to control the crowds. They're a little annoyed with Alice Paul having to work 2 days in a row for the procession and the inauguration the next day. And they're not interested in helping out. So one of them even says to the women, you know, if you'd stayed home, you wouldn't have had this trouble. So the crowd swarm the street, block the procession, and then the crowd gets rowdy and women start getting grabbed and manhandled, and ugly, vile things yelled at them, things spit upon, women get pulled down off of floats, people get trampled. It becomes a huge melee. 100 people end up going to the hospital by the end of it. And it takes the cavalry coming over from Arlington to clear the route so that the procession can finish, which it does. And the next day, the newspapers all around the country not really talking about Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Everybody's talking about the women's suffrage procession. So Alice Paul has gotten everybody's attention, and she really does manage to bring new energy into what was kind of a stagnating women's suffrage movement. And I just want to point out also that anytime there is energy on one side of a movement, there's going to be energy in opposition. And so Alice Paul's ability to kind of stir up new attention to the suffrage movement also brings about a lot of ridicule and criticism of women's suffrage. And these are two items in our collection that are actually anti-suffrage items of propaganda, I'm sorry to say, with the cat. I mean, we all love the cats, right? And so if you thought cat memes were a fairly new thing, they've been around for a long time. So cats were often used to ridicule women fighting for the vote because, you know, don't they all sound like cats whining about their rights? And it would make as much sense to give a cat a vote as a woman. That's the one on the left there is kind of a, you know, that might as well let cats vote if you're going to let women vote. We have reclaimed the suffrage cat there as a pro-equality symbol. And I mean, look at that hat. Isn't that awesome? Now, things like the procession, a parade, a demonstration, those get a lot of attention and headlines, but they aren't really the things that move the needle, that get things done. This table here in this exhibit has a quote from Alva Belmont on it. It says, "Ours is the hard work, the painful work, the slow work." That's the kind of things like petitions and making phone calls and writing letters and trying to get more and more attention to your cause and trying to raise money. One of the things that Alice Paul does soon after the procession is to begin publishing a newsletter, The Suffragists. We have some of the printing blocks there on the right from the Suffragists. On the left, you see the first issue of the Suffragists that was issued in November of 1913. And you can see on the front is a cartoon that's kind of ridiculing the president. They have been sending delegations to the president and are not getting his support. Now, this is one of the things that really infuriates the leaders of NASA, particularly Carrie Chapman Catt, because NASA already has a newspaper called the Woman's Journal. It's got a huge distribution. Why is this new young upstart publishing her own newspaper, and why is she trying to antagonize the president? So pretty soon, Alice Paul ends up breaking away from NASA. She has already formed her own fundraising organization, which is another thing that makes NASA mad, called the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. NASA kicks them out, and so it become an independent organization, which eventually changes its name to National Women's Party, primarily supported by Alva Belmont. They're always very small in comparison to the work of NASA, which is much larger, has much more influence and much more money. But anytime you see pictures of women fighting for the vote, you're probably seeing people who were organized by the National Women's Party and Alice Paul, because they were really good at getting publicity. They always had photographers out there taking their pictures. So they were small, but very influential. And one of the ways they were influential is they had their own cartoonist. This is Nina Allender. She was a classically trained painter, but Alice Paul showed up and convinced her that what she needed to do was put her artistic talent to work in cartooning. And Nina Allender would later say that, you know, there was such a freedom in being able to express yourself through cartooning. Her images were gorgeously drawn, but they also were very funny often or provocative, and the women in them are all out in public, which was something that was really kind of groundbreaking. Women, when they were pictured at the time, were always pictured at home, taking care of the house, taking care of the children. Nina Allender's women are out there in public claiming their rights, often with their hands on their hips and their chin up. And this is one of my favorite one of Nina Allender's cartoons, and it sort of shows encapsulates their strategy. So here you have poor Cinderella, the woman without the vote, and she needs a constitutional amendment. That's the pumpkin there in the middle. But to get a constitutional amendment, she needs to get it pulled by and taken up by the House and the Senate. And you can see the members of the House and the Senate are just rats there. So she's looking to her fairy godmother. And if you'll notice the face on the fairy godmother, that's President Wilson. So she's looking to her fairy godmother, Wilson, in drag there, to wave his magic wand and transform those rats in the House and Senate, and so that Cinderella can have her constitutional amendment, enfranchising her. And that became kind of the strategy of the National Women's Party, that they would lobby Wilson. They'd say, Wilson, you are the president. You're the leader of the Democratic Party that controls both houses of Congress. We want you to support this amendment. And Wilson would say, ladies, I'm very busy. This is not important to me. Voting is a states' rights issue. If you want the vote, go back to your states and ask them. You can afford to wait. So they didn't just lobby the president. They, of course, if you want to get it through the House and Senate, you got to lobby the House and Senate. So they taught themselves how to lobby. And they didn't just know about where every member of Congress stood on the cause of suffrage. You can see the chart on the left where they're keeping track. They also found out everything they could about them. It was all men until 1916. And they knew, like, where did he golf? Who were his funders? What church did he go to? What can we find out about his wife or his mother? Can they be employed to support this? And they kept these really detailed notes about everything they knew about every member of Congress. No dirt, but of course, members of Congress didn't know that. They didn't know what in the heck these women knew about them. That card catalog with those lobbying notes became known as the Deadly Political Index, because they had the goods on everybody. And of course, if you want to change a member of Congress's mind, you also have to get his constituents on board. So they went all around the country, convincing people to support the women's right to vote and to get it by an amendment to the Constitution. And they went out to the West, where women had the vote. So the idea was, women, you have the vote that women in the East don't have. So use the power you've got to support women across the country and demand that your members of Congress support this amendment to the Constitution. This is on a train tour around the country. They're in Colorado in this one. The Suffrage Express, getting the word out. Now, these tours, they were grueling all around the country. Often, when they went by car, there were no good roads. When they went by train, it was dirty and sooty. And sometimes they got places where they weren't allowed to stay in a hotel, so they had to find a place to stay. It was exhausting work. One of the most dynamic speakers on those tours was Inez Milholland, the most beautiful suffragist. And in 1916, while she is out on tour, she gets very ill and dies. They're devastated. The most beautiful suffragist has given her life just trying to get the vote. And so by 1917, they are tired of asking. And so that's when they decide to come up with the protests that they're best known for. They decide to picket the White House. So this is the first delegation of picketers getting ready to head out to the White House, wearing their what has become their signature colors of purple, white, and gold on sashes and on banners. One thing that always strikes me about this is, the sash doesn't say anything on it. They don't have to say anything. Everybody knows when they see that tricolored sash, purple, white, and gold, that that's a suffragist. Those women are fighting for the right to vote. But they also carry banners with big, bold block lettering on them. By the way, this is New York Day at the pickets. So they show up in January when it's very cold, and they take up positions at the White House gates and stand there all day long, not saying anything, which is how they become known as the Silent Sentinels, just letting their banners do the talking. And they're often using Woodrow Wilson's own words against him. Mr. President, you say liberty is the fundamental demand of the human spirit. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? This is another one of those mirrors in the museum where you can stand as if you're one of the picketers, one of the Silent Sentinels. And here are some of the original banners from the picketing that we have in our collection. Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? One of the banners that President Obama saw when he came by the House 7 years ago. And then my favorite one on the right, the young are at the gates. We are the new generation. We are not putting up with being treated unequally any longer. We are demanding our rights. And so some people are appalled. Carrie Chapman Catt is furious. What are you doing? Respectable women do not stand on street corners. Do not stand on the sidewalk. You are making the cause of women's suffrage look ridiculous. But other people really admire them. They are out there day after day in all kinds of weather for months. Their determination, their tenacity is getting the nation's attention. People are coming in from around the country to take their turn as a picket and getting written up in their local papers. They're getting more and more attention. And then the U.S. enters World War I. Now they are out there picketing a president during wartime. That doesn't just seem unladylike. That's unpatriotic, un-American, maybe even treasonous. Who do these women think they are? And rather than kind of, back off, lay low, understand, the sensitivity of the political situation in the country right now, Alice Paul keeps organizing pickets, and the words on the banner start to get more and more provocative. Mr. President, how can you say that we are fighting this war to make the world safe for democracy? We don't have democracy in the United States if women can't vote. Mr. President, you are deceiving the world. And that kind of talk really starts to get people angry. And as you can see in this picture, crowds start to gather. They start attacking the picketers, pulling their banners down, knocking them around. The police are having to break up violence in front of the White House. And they've had enough. They say, that's it, Alice Paul, you are causing too much trouble. You ladies show up here again and we're going to arrest you. And Alice Paul said it wasn't illegal in January when we started. It's not illegal now. We have a right and we are not stopping. And so when the women continue to show up, they know exactly what's coming. And as promised, they are arrested. The police at first don't know what to do with them and release them, thinking, well, maybe that'll scare them off, but women keep showing up, keep getting arrested. So eventually they have to figure out what to charge them with. They charge them with obstructing traffic for standing on the sidewalk, failure to move on, which is a citation and a fine, but the women won't pay the fine. So the judge is frustrated and said, all right, then spend 3 days in jail. That'll shut it down. No more women showing up, getting arrested. The judge is getting frustrated. So the sentences start getting longer, 30 days, 60 days, and not in the DC jail. Now you're going to go to the women's prison, the Occoquan workhouse, which is filthy and dangerous. And it's a workhouse. They have to work hard. And women keep coming. I met one woman who told me the story about her grandmother and great aunt who lived in New York and saw an ad in the paper that said, "Come and picket, you will be arrested." And they came, and they were. This is going on for months. More and more of the suffrage leaders are in prison. So Alice Paul decides she needs to come out from organizing and actually be there on the picket line, which is dangerous. Of course, they're gunning for her as the leader. This is the banner she walks out with. It says, "The time has come to conquer or submit. For us, there is but one choice. We have made it." That's a quote from Woodrow Wilson talking about why the U.S. has entered World War I. She is saying, the things you say we're fighting for, that's what I'm fighting for. She would later say, when men are denied justice, they go to war. This is our war, only we're fighting it with banners instead of guns. She's arrested, and her sentence is 7 months. And they try to send her to the insane asylum, the mental hospital, because they figure this woman must be mentally ill, that she won't give this up. That was common for women at the time who were causing too much trouble. Their husbands or their fathers could just show up and commit them, just say they were, having the womanly hysteria or whatever. Luckily for Alice, the doctor doesn't commit her. He says she's perfectly sane. She just wants to vote. But all of the women begin to protest their conditions through hunger strikes, just like in Britain. And just like in Britain, the response is forced feeding. Now, this is a quote from one of the women, Lucy Burns, who was imprisoned more than any other American woman suffragist, about what forced feeding felt like. She said, "I was held down by 5 people at legs, arms, and head. I refused to open mouth. The doctor pushed the tube up my left nostril. I turned and twisted my head all I could, but he managed to push it up. It hurts nose and throat very much and makes nose bleed freely. Tube drawn out, covered with blood. Operation leaves one very sick. Food dumped directly into stomach, feels like a ball of lead. Left nostril, throat, and muscles of neck very sore all night." So, this was just horrific. These women were tortured. They know how to get the word out about what's happening to them. We have this description because Lucy Burns manages to scribble down this and smuggle it out with one of the friendly guards or another prisoner who gets out. So the press is reporting about this. Prominent women like Alva Belmont and the prominent husbands and fathers of women who are imprisoned are speaking to the press, and there becomes a public uproar about what's happening to these women. So the pressure gets to be too much, and Woodrow Wilson pardons all the women and sends them home just in time for Thanksgiving, so they can get back and Thanksgiving dinner. So Alice Paul didn't have to serve 7 months. And they take a few days to recover, and then they have a great big reception at the theater that's right next to the White House, the Belasco Theater. Crowds gather again, but this time they don't want to attack the women. They want to see them because now they've become celebrities, all these suffrage prisoners. They have a big ceremony where every woman who went to prison is awarded a jail door pin. And this one is the one we have in our collection, which they wore very proudly. You think you can shame us and lock us away? No, we're going to wear the fact that we were jailed for freedom as a badge of honor. And they keep up the demonstrations. Right around that time is when the flu pandemic hits. So there's not as much public gatherings, and everybody's pretty worn out from all this picketing. So they do keep having demonstrations, though. On the right, you see women climbing up on the Lafayette statue, and what she's doing is burning Wilson's words about democracy. They got arrested for that. The woman in the middle there, Lucy Branham, says, all my life they've been telling me I should be up on a pedestal, and the first time I climb up on one, I get arrested. On the left is the watchfire demonstrations when Wilson was overseas negotiating the Treaty of Paris. Every time the press would report something about his words praising democracy, they'd take them out and burn them in a fire in front of the White House and get arrested again, because you can't burn a fire in front of the White House. So they kept up the pressure. And eventually, Woodrow Wilson decided that, in fact, he did support an amendment to the U.S. Constitution enfranchising women, although he made very clear that it was not because of those troublemakers picketing him and causing all those problems out there. He said, "The voices of the agitators reach me not at all." This is Wilson addressing Congress and asking for the members of Congress to support this amendment, to pass it, to recognize all of the women who have supported the war effort on the home front. So we ask them to join us in service and sacrifice and not in liberty. Whatever the reason for his change of heart, it turned out Alice Paul was right to target the president, because once he started to support the amendment, things started to move. Now, it didn't happen right away. Nothing in Congress ever does. But by June of 1919, the amendment has passed Congress. Woohoo! But that's only the first part. That The second part of getting an amendment to the Constitution is getting it ratified by 3/4 of the states. So that effort that's all been concentrated on Washington, D.C. now spreads out across the country, and it's a race. They really feel like they have got to get this amendment ratified before the November 1920 election, because after that, there's going to be a new president and everything can change. So that means they really have to get states to call their own often special sessions of their legislature to vote on this amendment. And they're getting one state after another. By this point, 28 states have some form of women's suffrage. One of the most significant was New York, one of the biggest, I think the biggest by population state. Women had won full suffrage there in 1917. So what had seemed so crazy, so outrageous when Elizabeth Cady Stanton first introduced it, now has become much more commonplace. And despite what all those anti-suffragists have been saying, it turns out when women vote, society does not collapse. Men and women don't switch places or anything. And so it's got much more support. And so one state after another is ready to ratify this amendment. They're making it happen. By March of 1920, they have 35 of the 36 states they need. All the ones that you see in gold are kind of brown. But you see those ones in gray, including my own state of Maryland? Those states either have voted no, or they're just sort of putting it off. They're not voting at all. So when it comes up for a vote in Tennessee in August of 1920, they really think this is our last chance. So all eyes are down there at the State House in Nashville. Kind of like it's been the last couple of days. Everybody looking at Nashville. I missed this part. Sorry. Every time one of those states ratified the amendment, Alice Paul took one of those suffrage banners and started turning it into a ratification banner. So she would sew a star onto the ratification banner every time one of those states ratified the amendment. And on the right there, you see one of the Nina Allender cartoons about the victory stars. You see Montana, Nebraska, Arkansas have all ratified, but Georgia, poor Georgia over there, they have rejected it. So everybody's down in Tennessee. This is the National Women's Party's campaign office they set out down there in Nashville. Carrie Chapman Catt is down there at the Hermitage Hotel. NASA is fighting. The anti-suffragists have also shown up, and everybody's campaigning, trying to get these members of this Tennessee state legislature on their side. The Tennessee State Senate takes a vote. They vote to ratify the amendment. It goes to the Tennessee State House, and it's a tie. Oh, are you kidding me? All this time, all this work, it's come down to convincing one guy to change his mind, and both sides are going at it and negotiating and lobbying. One of the things that's happened is that roses are being distributed. So if one of these state legislatures is wearing a yellow rose, that means he's a suff. He's going to vote yes. But if it's a red rose, he's an anti. He's going to vote no. And if you were there in the Tennessee State House that day in Nashville, and you looked around and counted up all the roses as they're about to take another vote, you'd say, oh, well, we're about to have another tie. No one's changed their vote. But Harry Byrne, the youngest guy there, only 24, that's him on the left, wearing the red rose, has already voted no, but he's got a letter in his pocket. It's a long letter, but part of it reads, hurrah, and vote for suffrage, and don't keep them in doubt. And it's signed, don't forget to be a good boy. Lots of love. Over there on the right, Mama, Feb Byrne, wrote a letter to her boy, Harry, and Harry listened, and he changed his vote. That was the one vote that made the difference. Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment 72 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, and the women of this country had secured to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. And in the middle there, you see members of the National Women's Party shaking hands with the Tennessee legislators who supported suffrage. Woohoo! Victory! There's the Alice Paul at the headquarters of the National Women's Party unfurling the ratification banner with 36 stars on it. The amendment became part of the U.S. Constitution on August 26th, 1920. And since 1971, we now celebrate August 26th as Women's Equality Day. But of course, August 26th was not the day that women won equality. It's just the day they won the vote. The vote was not the end. The vote was just the beginning. One of the National Women's Party members, Crystal Eastman, said, okay, good, now we can begin. Alice Paul said, it's incredible to me that any woman should consider the fight for full equality one. It has just begun. There's hardly a field, economic or political, in which the natural and unaccustomed policy is not to ignore women. Unless women are prepared to fight politically, they must be content to be ignored politically. And so the National Women's Party continued on and continued to fight. In fact, they didn't move into the headquarters that is now Belmont-Paul until 1929. They moved there specifically to be very close to Congress. They said it's not merely a headquarters for our party that we plan, but an embassy for the women of the nation, a center of thought and activity, and a vantage point to keep Congress under perpetual observation. So here you can see with their lobbying skills, they've all just gotten their lobbying assignments, and they're ready to head up the hill to fight for women, for all of the many different ways that women are treated unequally. In 1922, they come up with a new list, kind of an update to the Declaration of Sentiments. This is their Declaration of Principles. And it starts out, whereas women today, although enfranchised, are in every way subordinate to men before the law, in government, in educational opportunities, in the professions, in the church, in industry, and in the home. So they might have the vote, but everything else is still to be won. As you see this picture over here, the cartoon by Nina Allender of the ghost of Susan B. Anthony, the spirit of Susan B. Anthony showing up to these newly enfranchised women and saying, but everything but the vote is still to be won. That Declaration of Principles continued, be it resolved that as a part of our campaign to remove all forms of the subjection of women, we shall work for the following immediate objects. And it has a long list of things. You see in this cartoon, the government plums, they might both be citizens, but the boy is getting all the plums and the girl citizen is left out. But the first thing they put on their list is that women shall no longer be regarded and shall no longer regard themselves as inferior to men, but the equality of the sexes shall be recognized. So this idea that the belief that women are inferior is not a belief that just men hold, that women need to learn not to think that about themselves as well. another thing they do is they immediately start supporting women running for office, that it's not enough to be casting ballots, your name's got to be on the ballot as well. And so I love this particular mirror, particularly when I see young people, young girls and boys come up and stand in front of that mirror and see those words, I will run for office. And that has been a long fight. Here we are in 2023, and over 100 years later, women on average still only hold about 20% of elected offices. And there for a long time, there was this idea, you can see some trailblazers in the reflection on the picture there, but you know, that it takes an exceptional woman, that someone kind of a modern day superwoman, Wonder Woman, to be able to run for office. It's been really inspiring lately, though, to see women from all walks of life, see people from all walks of life just saying, you know what? I want change. My hat is in the ring. As Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman elected to Congress, would say, if they won't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. Be in the room. Get your voice heard. And then came the 75th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1923. The National Women's Party went to have their convention up there. Great big pageant, as you would have, you know, you dress up like Amazons to celebrate all the accomplishments of women. This is on the lakes there at Seneca Falls. And at their convention, they announced their intention to go back to amending the Constitution again. This time, not for the vote, but for full equality. So 100 years ago, Alice Paul and the National Women's Party introduced, they called it the Lucretia Mott Amendment. Today, we call it the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA. Had a couple of different wordings. Eventually, it would also be called the Alice Paul Amendment. But this is the most recent version. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Whatever else you might have thought about the Equal Rights Amendment, that is all the wording says, that and that Congress can pass laws to enforce it. When Alice Paul first announces it, it gets introduced into Congress in December 1923, and they start having hearings, and it turns out that the National Women's Party is the only women's groups that's on board with the Equal Rights Amendment. There are concerns. So much of society is set up for women to be inferior. If you put this amendment out there, will women lose their protection, lose the ways that they are supposed to be supported by society? There is a lot of resistance to it. Some of it from women really supporting women's equality, but thinking this is the wrong way to go about it. But others who are just annoyed with all this nonsense, thinks things have gone too far. Paul, this is from a senator from New Hampshire. You can see that he says he thinks it's a fool amendment is through putting embroidery in the Constitution. You know, women's equality, that's just crazy, frilly stuff. Now, here's something the National Women's Party didn't do while they were fighting for all of these things, including the Equal Rights Amendment. They didn't deal with the way that women were still being kept from voting. They got letters. They had people speak to them. Mary Church Terrell came and said, we need your help. Women wrote letters and said, they won't let us register. Please help. And Alice Paul and the National Women's Party's response was, that's a race issue, not a sex issue. And that's not our issue. So we're not going to help. They didn't see the issue of racial oppression as an equality issue for women. So this is one of the panels that is in our museum, and you can see barriers to voting past and present. Some of them, like poll taxes, have been solved by constitutional amendment. Others of them are new innovations and are still problems. And so there's a new generation of suffragists, particularly in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, although maybe they didn't call themselves that. People like Amelia Boynton on the left there, who organizes people in her hometown of Selma, Alabama, to fight for voter registration, and is instrumental in the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. And this is a picture of Amelia after she's been beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. On the right is Fannie Lou Hamer testifying before the Democratic National Committee at the convention in 1964 about the horrors that she has faced trying to register to vote. And how can we call this a democracy? I question, is this America? And it's because of work of women like this that a very important moment in the fight for gender equality happens. And it's something that the National Women's Party is not really on board with at first. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They're not a supporter of race equality, but what they are able to do is get the word sex inserted into Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, where it talks about employment, that one of the areas where you cannot discriminate in employment, race, color, religion, national origin, and sex. And that actually ends up giving birth to second wave feminism. A reminder that all of these issues are interrelated, because what happens is that part of the Civil Rights Act is treated like a joke. Well, of course, we're not going to treat women equally in the workplace. That's ridiculous. And so a new generation of civil rights activists and feminists begin to see or begin to believe that they're never going to get equality until they can get the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution. So this is Pauli Murray, who's one of the architects of the civil rights strategy of challenging segregation in the courts, who didn't support the Equal Rights Amendment initially because she said our rights are already in the 14th Amendment. But after 1964, she begins to be one of the voices in support of the Equal Rights Amendment, and part of a new generation of women who take up the cause of their own equality and the Equal Rights Amendment as a vehicle for obtaining it as their new cause, and start things like marches and demonstrations and women's strikes and legal challenges as a way to bring that about. And the ERA gets new support. And in 1972, it passes through Congress with bipartisan support. It's out to the states for ratification. It looks like it's going to get ratified, no problem. And then the opposition gets stronger too. There is a whole group of people fighting against the ERA, but the best known is this woman, Phyllis Schlafly, who begins to argue that equality is not good for women, that women deserve to be put up on a pedestal. They need privileges and protections as carers of the home and the bearers of children. In fact, her group Stop ERA, STOP is supposed to be an acronym for Stop Taking Our Privileges. She tells people equality, in essence, would be oppression. Equality is something to fear. She is very good at getting people afraid. She's also very good at making people angry. She's maybe the original troll. And the tide turns and support for the ERA dries up. All the things that they're mentioning are things to be worried about. Women in the draft, won't be gender neutral bathrooms. Men in the maternity ward, apparently something to be afraid of. I just have to point out, though, that these, if you notice what these protesters are doing, They are picketing the White House. They're taking Alice Paul's own innovative strategy and using it against her amendment. I did talk to someone who told a story about having been in Congress in 1972, been at the Capitol in 1972 when the ERA passed, and coming over to the National Women's Party headquarters to celebrate with Alice Paul and finding Alice Paul in tears and not of joy, because one of the other parts of the amendment that got added said that the amendment had to be ratified within 7 years of passing Congress by 3/4 of the states. And Alice Paul said that is going to kill it. They are sending the message to the opponents that all you have to do is wait it out and the ERA will go away. And that's what ended up happening. 35 states ratified the amendment, and then nothing more was happening. This is a march from the 1-year anniversary of Alice Paul's death. People marching in 1978 to get that time limit extended. It works. They get the time limit extended for 3 more years, but it doesn't matter. In 1982, the time limit expires and the amendment is still 3 states short of ratification. And the ERA is dead. Or so we thought. Because in 2017, out of the blue, Nevada voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And then in 2018, Illinois voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And then in January of 2020, Virginia voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Well, that's 3, right? Well, except there's that time limit. And also the states you see here in light blue, those are all states that ratified, but since then they have voted to rescind their ratification, which there's a question of whether you can do that. But in any case, looks like it's been in the courts. So far, it hasn't gotten anywhere in the courts. There is just recently formed a new caucus in Congress to try and remove the time limit for ratification and get the ERA as the 28th Amendment. There's also people who reintroduce the Equal Rights Amendment every year, and sometimes they say equality based on sex is not going far enough. And maybe it needs new updated language. So what will happen with the ERA? We don't know. But now that we're in the 21st century, what does equality look like now? What do the stories of the past tell us about what to do to work for equality and justice in the future? And I'm going to end on kind of a counter note to John Meacham's argument that we look to the past, it brings us out of despair. We remember that we've been through things before, and we look to the leaders of the past to have hope for the future. In honor of National Poetry Month, I just want to end with this poem from a new book that I don't think is in the library yet, but maybe will be soon, by poet Clint Smith. He does have a book called How the Word is Passed that I definitely recommend that you can get at the library. But this is what he says is one of the first poems that he wrote for the book. And he posted this picture on his Twitter, so I think I'm okay to share it. It says, when people say we have made it through worse before, all I hear is the wind slapping against all the gravestones of those who did not make it, those who did not survive to see the confetti fall from the sky, those who did not live to watch the parade roll down the street. I have grown accustomed to a lifetime of aphorisms meant to assuage my fears, pithy sayings meant to convey that all ends up fine in the end. But there is no solace in rearranging language to make a different word tell the same lie. Sometimes the moral arc of the universe does not bend in a direction that comforts us. Sometimes it bends in ways we don't expect, and there are people who fall off in the process. Please, dear reader, do not say that I am hopeless. I believe there is a better future to fight for. I simply accept the possibility that I may not live to see it. I have grown weary of telling myself lies that I might one day begin to believe. We are not all left standing after the war has ended. Some of us have become ghosts by the time the dust has settled. And I use that also as a reminder that sometimes you have to train up the next generation. You have to support the new young at the gates who are taking up the torch, who are working at the desks of those who have come before and taken up the work. Just like the suffragists did, just like the second wave feminists did. And so when you see things that are wrong, when you see injustice, when you see things that need to change, I hope that by sharing this story today, you might get a little inspiration from all those troublemakers, from the National Women's Party, from the second wave feminists, all those who plowed the ground before us. So thank you so much for your time, everybody.